Maple Hollow was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. It sat quietly between pine-covered hills, with only one main road and a handful of traffic lights. Everyone knew each other's names, routines, and even secrets, at least. They thought they did. It was a peaceful place, the kind of community where parents let their kids play outside until dark without worry. But everything changed one warm August afternoon when 8-year-old Eli Turner disappeared. Eli was a quiet boy with a shy smile and big eyes that always seemed to be searching for something. He lived with his father, Daniel Turner, a construction supervisor, and his stepmother, Marla. His biological mother had passed away when he was only 3, and Daniel had remarried just a year later. From the outside, their family looked normal, if a little distant. But people in town had always sensed something was off when it came to Marla and the boy. Marla kept to herself and rarely smiled. She never came to school events or joined other parents at community gatherings. Teachers had occasionally noticed Eli coming to class with bruises or acting withdrawn, but every time someone raised a concern, it was explained away. "He's just clumsy," Marla would say, or "he plays too rough with the neighborhood kids." With no solid proof and no complaints from Eli himself, no action was ever taken. On the morning of his disappearance, Daniel left early for a 2-day work trip out of town. He kissed Eli on the head, told him to be good, and handed the reins of parenting to Marla. According to Marla, Eli had gone out to ride his bike that afternoon and never returned. She said she searched for him for over an hour before calling the police. But something about her story didn't sit right with the investigators from the start. The police arrived quickly, and within hours the town transformed into a search zone. Volunteers poured in from nearby areas. Flyers with Eli's photo were taped to storefronts, car windows, and telephone poles. Drones flew overhead, and dogs sniffed through fields and creeks. But by the end of the day, there was no trace of Ellie, no bike, no backpack, no footprints. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. As the sun set, a deep sense of unease crept over Maple Hollow. Families locked their doors for the first time in years. Parents clutched their children tighter. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a case of a lost child. It felt different. It felt colder, darker. Investigators began retracing Eli's steps, checking surveillance footage from nearby gas stations and houses. They interviewed neighbors, teachers, and friends. What emerged was a pattern: stories about how Eli seemed scared lately, how he flinched when Marla raised her voice, how he had once told a classmate he wished he could run away. Daniel returned home immediately upon hearing the news. He was devastated, unable to believe his son was gone. He begged for answers, for someone to find Eli, to bring him back. But with every hour that passed, hope began to dim. The news reached national outlets. Within 48 hours, commentators called it another tragic case of a missing child, but those closer to the situation suspected more. Something felt staged, controlled, as if Eli hadn't just gone missing, but had been taken. And not by a stranger. The people of Maple Hollow began to look inward, asking the questions no one had dared to ask before. What really happened in the Turner house after Daniel left? Could Marla be hiding something? And if so, was Eli still alive? No one said it out loud, but more than a few believed the same chilling thought. Maybe the monster wasn't in the woods. Maybe it was already inside the home. The investigation quickly turned its focus toward the one person who had been alone with Eli when he vanished: Marla Turner. Detectives found her behavior increasingly suspicious. During interviews, she appeared cold, detached, and unemotional. While most parents of missing children were frantic, begging for updates or crying out of sheer desperation, Marla simply sat with her arms crossed, answering questions with short, rehearsed responses. She showed no signs of distress, not even when shown Eli's photo. Her version of events remained consistent at first. She claimed Eli had asked to ride his bike outside around noon, and she had allowed it. She said she was cleaning the bathroom upstairs when she noticed he hadn't returned. After searching the neighborhood and calling out for him for nearly an hour, she said she finally called the police. But neighbors quickly contradicted her timeline. One woman who lived across the street said she never saw Eli outside that day, though she had seen Marla's car leave the driveway that morning. Another neighbor claimed to have heard yelling coming from inside the house the night before. Eli disappeared. With inconsistencies piling up, investigators requested a search warrant for the home. Inside, they found the house eerily tidy, with no signs of a struggle. But when they reached the basement, everything changed. Tucked behind a tall storage cabinet was a narrow locked door. Behind it, they discovered a small, windowless room. There was a thin mattress on the floor, a child-sized blanket, and a bucket in the corner. On the walls were faint scratch marks, some smeared with dried blood. A torn t-shirt that matched the color of one Eli had worn in school photos lay bald. Up in the corner, Marla claimed she had no idea the room existed. She said it must have been built by a previous homeowner. But the mattress was new, the bucket clean, and the blanket still carried the scent of laundry detergent. Detectives didn't believe her. Forensics confirmed the blood on the wall belonged to Eli. The story took a darker turn when investigators pulled Marla's phone records. On the day Eli vanished, her GPS data showed a strange detour. She had driven nearly 3 hours into the dense forest west of town. It was an isolated area, known mostly for old logging roads and abandoned cabins. She had stayed there for nearly 40 minutes before returning home. When asked about the trip, she claimed she had gotten lost while running errands. But she couldn't produce receipts, and no one in town had seen her at any stores that day. Investigators now suspected that Marla hadn't just lost Eli, she had intentionally taken him somewhere. But why, and to whom? Further digging into Marla's past revealed something that had gone unnoticed until now. Before marrying Daniel, she had no close family, no strong employment history, and very few digital footprints. Her childhood records were sealed, but enough fragments surfaced to raise alarm. She had spent part of her youth in the foster care system and had changed homes multiple times. Her final foster placement, in particular, raised red flags. A man named Harold Mason had been investigated in the late 1980s for allegations of child abuse. Though the charges were dropped, he disappeared soon after, living entirely off the grid. There was no concrete evidence tying Marla to Harold Mason yet, but the pieces were beginning to align in chilling ways. Investigators theorized that Marla may have reconnected with someone from her past, someone who shared her history of trauma and instability. The image of Eli in a locked basement room haunted everyone working the case. They knew now that this wasn't just a missing child investigation. It was something more calculated, more twisted. Marla was arrested for obstruction and child endangerment, but she refused to speak. No confession, no explanation. Only silence. Meanwhile, search teams were dispatched to the forest location, logged in her phone. What they found next would change the entire course of the investigation and reveal a secret buried for decades. Asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk. The forest that Marla had visited was vast, stretching over thousands of acres, with no marked trails and few signs of human presence. It was the kind of place where people could disappear without a trace. Search teams arrived equipped with drones, thermal cameras, and scent-tracking dogs. The area had to be combed inch by inch. For 2 full days, they found nothing. The silence of the forest only deepened the dread until a park ranger, following a rarely used hunting trail, noticed something strange. A trail of old tin cans, plastic wrappers, and a piece of fabric snagged on a low-hanging branch. Following the trail deeper into the woods, the team stumbled upon a makeshift camp, camouflaged under heavy brush. At first glance, it looked abandoned, but as they approached, they saw movement. A ragged man stepped out from behind a curtain of hanging sheets. His hair was long, gray, and wild. His clothes were tattered and filthy. And standing behind him, barefoot and silent, was Eli Turner. The boy's face was pale and hollow. His arms were bruised, and his clothes were torn, but he was alive. The man did not resist when authorities rushed in. He simply raised his hands and said nothing. Eli was quickly removed from the area and taken by helicopter to the nearest hospital. Doctors confirmed that he was dehydrated and malnourished, but had no major physical injuries. He had gone nearly 6 days with very little food and water. His mental state, however, was more fragile. At first, Eli wouldn't speak. He flinched at loud noises, refused to eat, and stared at the floor. It took hours before he uttered his first words to a child psychologist. Slowly, through drawings and whispers, a picture began to form of what had happened. Eli said that on the morning of his disappearance, Marla had woken him early and told him they were going on a special trip. She packed a small bag for him and told him not to say anything to anyone. They drove for hours into the woods. When they arrived, the man was already waiting. Eli said Marla hugged the man, spoke to him for a while, and then told Eli she would be back soon. She never returned. The man, who had not yet identified himself, had made Eli sleep on a mattress made from old rags. He gave him cold canned food and told him not to scream. Though he didn't hurt Eli, his behavior was unpredictable. He often muttered to himself and paced in circles. He called Eli by a different name, Charlie, and sometimes cried when looking at him. Back at the station, fingerprint analysis confirmed what investigators had suspected. The man was Harold Mason, the same foster parent from Marla's childhood. After vanishing from public records more than 30 years ago, he had built a life entirely off the grid, surviving in the wilderness without identification, taxes, or any government contact. He had become a ghost. Harold finally spoke, but only in fragments. He claimed Marla had come to him for help, that she believed she was protecting the boy from something evil. He insisted he never meant to harm Eli, that he only did what Marla asked, but nothing he said made full sense. His mind seemed fractured, lost somewhere between memory and delusion. Though Eli had been found, the mystery was far from over. Why had Marla taken him there? What connection truly existed between her and Harold? And what did she mean by protecting Eli? Detectives began to wonder if this case wasn't just about a disappearance. It was about a shared past, twisted beliefs, and a dangerous bond between two deeply broken people. Eli had survived, but the truth behind why he was taken was still buried, and it was far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Asterisk. The discovery of Harold Mason and Eli deep in the forest sent shockwaves through Maple Hollow and beyond. News outlets picked up the story, spinning it into headlines about a feral man living in the woods and a stepmother with a dark past. But behind the sensationalism, investigators were quietly piecing together a far more complex and disturbing narrative, one that began decades before Eli was ever born. Following Harold's identification, detectives began a deep dive into his history. In the late 1980s, he had been a state-certified foster parent, taking in children who were difficult to place. His file was slim, but hidden among old case logs and forgotten paperwork were allegations of emotional abuse, physical punishment, and isolation tactics. Several children had come forward, but none of the claims stuck due to lack of evidence. One of those children was Marla. At the time, Marla had been around 9 years old. Records showed she had been in 3 different foster homes before being placed with Harold. She stayed with him for nearly 3 years. Then, without warning, she was removed from the home and placed elsewhere. Case notes were vague, mentioning only concerns of inappropriate behavior and a non-cooperative foster parent. Not long after, Harold disappeared completely from the foster system and public life when investigators confronted Marla. With this history during a second round of questioning, she remained silent. Even with the evidence piling up, she refused to speak about her childhood or about Harold. But a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation began to offer some insight. According to the report, Marla exhibited signs of long-term psychological trauma, including dissociation and unresolved attachment issues. Her behavior toward Eli, the basement room, and the decision to bring him to Harold began to make a chilling kind of sense. Experts concluded that Marla's years with Harold had deeply shaped her view of parenting and authority. Instead of processing her abuse as something harmful, she had reinterpreted it as a form of love, a twisted survival mechanism that made Harold not just her abuser, but also her protector. In her mind, bringing Eli to Harold wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a form of obedience, a way of returning to the only person who had ever made her feel safe, even if that safety had come wrapped in fear and control. Further investigation revealed that Marla had been visiting Harold secretly for over a year. Phone pings, gas station purchases near the forest, and deleted text messages confirmed multiple trips. Though Harold had no cell phone or access to the internet, he had created a hidden life in the woods, complete with storage bins of food, old books, even photographs of Marla as a child, kept inside a sealed tin box. When authorities returned to the forest to collect more evidence, they uncovered a disturbing detail. Carved into the inside wall of Harold's shack were a series of names, first names only, scratched into the wood. Investigators later matched several of them to children who had been in his care decades ago. It became clear Harold had been reliving those years over and over in isolation, preserving a reality where he still held control over the children who once lived under his roof. Harold was charged with unlawful confinement, child endangerment, and multiple historical abuse allegations as more former foster children came forward. His mental health made him unfit for a standard prison sentence, and he was transferred to a secure psychiatric institution. Marla, facing charges of conspiracy and attempted child abduction, continued to say nothing in court. She showed no emotion, as her entire past was laid bare before the public. Eli, meanwhile, was recovering slowly. He spoke more freely now, but only with his father or his therapist. He remembered the cold forest nights, the strange mutterings of the man in the shack, and the moment his stepmother said goodbye without looking back. He didn't understand why she did it, and no one could give him an answer he believed. One thing had become terrifyingly clear to everyone involved. This wasn't just a story of a missing boy. It was the unraveling of a generational cycle of trauma, one that had festered in silence for decades, and had only just come into the light. Asterisk. The final chapter in Eli Turner's story unfolded not in the forest, nor in a courtroom, but in the minds of a community trying to make sense of the unthinkable. Maple Hollow, once defined by its quiet streets and predictable routines, had been permanently altered. People no longer looked at their neighbors the same way. A lingering question hung in the air. How could something so horrifying happen right under everyone's noses? Eli returned home with his father Daniel, who was grappling with guilt and disbelief. He blamed himself for leaving Eli alone with Marla, for not seeing the signs, for trusting someone he barely understood. Though he tried to return life to normal, there was no going back. Their house felt like a museum of trauma, every room a reminder of what had nearly been lost. Eventually, Daniel sold the home and relocated to another town, hoping that a fresh start might offer healing. Eli began therapy several times a week. Progress was slow and uneven. Some days he would talk about what happened in the woods. Other days he would go completely silent, staring out the window for hours. He had nightmares about the man who called him Charlie, about the dark trees, about his stepmother's voice telling him she'd return soon. He didn't understand why she never did. No one had an answer that made sense to an 8-year-old. The investigation continued behind the scenes. More former foster children came forward with stories about Harold Mason. Their accounts painted a picture of a deeply disturbed man who operated just beneath the system's radar, using control, fear, and isolation to maintain authority over the children in his care. His disappearance from public life had allowed decades of pain to go unnoticed and unpunished. For Marla, the consequences were swift and severe. Though she never spoke another word during the investigation, the evidence was overwhelming. The photos, the visits, the GPS data, and most damning of all, the basement room left no doubt about her role. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described her actions as an intentional and calculated betrayal of a vulnerable child, and an extension of her own unresolved trauma, weaponized against the innocent. But the courtroom wasn't the end of it. Psychologists, child welfare advocates, and journalists all began dissecting the case. Documentaries, news specials, and opinion pieces flooded in. Some focused on the failures of the foster system that had allowed Harold Mason to ever gain custody of children. Others examined the psychological impact of childhood trauma left untreated, asking whether Marla was a villain or a victim or both. For many, the story became more than just a headline. It became a symbol of the dangers that come when pain is ignored, when history repeats itself in silence. Marla hadn't simply hurt Eli. She had tried to recreate a distorted past in which suffering felt familiar, even safe. She had chosen Harold not just because of who he was, but because of what he represented to her: control, identity, memory. And in doing so, she had risked a child's life to keep her own delusions intact. In the years that followed, Eli slowly began to recover. He started school again in a different town, under a different name. His father worked closely with therapists to help him rebuild trust and find joy in small things. A dog, art classes, long walks without fear. He still bore the emotional scars of what had happened, but he was moving forward, step by step. What stayed with people most wasn't just the horror of what occurred, but the haunting realization that monsters don't always live in the shadows. Sometimes they wear the face of someone trusted, someone in the home. And sometimes, the most dangerous legacy isn't what's done, but what's left unresolved. Eli's story ended with survival, but it began a broader conversation about protection, about vigilance, and about the hard truths that often hide behind closed doors. Asterisk.